I just want to say at the outset, though, that there are 2 points that Feroz made and that you drew out, Henry, that I think I can comment on later, which is one, hybrid warfare by Pakistan, because I spent some time in 2017 in the Kashmir Valley talking to security officers, intelligence officers there, and they very much believe that Pakistan's primary strategy in Kashmir is it's far less kinetic and infiltration-based and much more organized around information warfare, because it's just, you get more bang for your buck in that way, which is why Lashkar-e-Taiba in particular is recruiting a lot in terms of cyber cells as opposed to more militants to go blow themselves up. And the second point is on this question of how do we create friction between Russia and China and the Eurasian landmass. A question that came up, I was talking to some Japanese foreign ministry officials, their objective has been, they said, at least this one guy said to me explicitly, their objective is to try to bait China as much as possible into Afghanistan, to do more in Afghanistan. You've seen these recent reports about their military stations in Tajikistan actually sort of having sort of operations through the Wakhan corridor, but their objective is, they believe, their theory of this is that the more China is drawn into Afghanistan, the more it comes into friction with Russia and Central Asia. Okay, so I'll talk about the India side of this. This is a project that I've taken on a couple co-authors because when Henry encouraged me to think about this, I was about to go on paternity leave, so I didn't have a ton of time to do it on my own. So my co-authors aren't here, and they've done the bulk of the empirical work, and I've been thinking about the conceptual framework for this. And the basic question is, we know that the Indians and the Soviets spent a lot of time together, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And what came out of that, right? You would expect the amount of sort of interactions, commingling, training, discussions, and weapon sales, that there would be a residue that would sort of translate conceptually into how India thinks about operations, doctrine, et cetera. And so we set out to sort of look for traces of this residue, see if any of that still exists today in the Indian military or existed at some point in time in Indian military sort of doctrinal concepts and operational concepts. And I'd say, like, we started out with the Delphi method, which was basically, let's go ask a bunch of Indian retired officers, how much do the Russians have, influence have on you? And their answer was typically not much. But there's a little bit of, retroactive, selective, learning, recall bias, and sometimes these things are structural and ingrained without being able to sort of draw them out explicitly. So we thought about it a little bit more, and we've gone back and spent some time thinking about a conceptual framework, which is if we were really to investigate this thoroughly, which I think we've done, a kind of a first crack at this, but if we were going to investigate this really thoroughly, where would we look to find evidence of this? So that got us into some conceptual policy questions or foundational questions about what is doctrine and what is India's doctrine, and what are sort of the mechanisms by which it could be shaped. And the reason we think about these mechanisms is we think that there's sort of a rough correlation between India's development of the Sundarji doctrine and breakthrough operations and sort of major strike operations against Pakistan in the 80s that they tried to develop and employ and resource. And there's a correlation between that and the Soviet concept of operational maneuver groups. But this happens around the same time. So maybe that sort of, there's a correlation there. Can we say there's causal influence? And the only way we can sort of try to assess that causality is if we look at these particular mechanisms and pathways for diffusion of ideas and diffusion of doctrine. So I would say we come out this kind of, if you think about it in statistical terms, we think there is plausibly there's an existence of a diffusion mechanism, a relationship between what the Soviets were thinking and what the Indians were thinking. But how much influence of that? What would be the coefficient of this statistical relationship if we thought there was a statistical relationship? It's pretty minimal, we think. And then the last question is sort of what is the consequence of this? It's hard to say that there's much. This would be the R squared in a statistical model. The consequence, we don't think it's very much because we think it's a little overdetermined by what the Indians already were aiming to do. And so in a way, if there are sort of, the bottom line is that we think that there are sources of Russian indirect influence or Soviet indirect influence on Indian concepts, and then some ideas reinforced what the Indians kind of wanted to do anyways. But some of that reinforcement gave them the motivation to sort of continue with this idea of breakthrough operations well into the nuclear period, and to hold on to it for an extended period of time, perhaps even still holding on to it, at least till 2004, when it was very clear that India couldn't think about breakthrough operations against Pakistan and severing Pakistan in two, because this was under the nuclear umbrella. But the residue still held for a long time. So I'll skip over some of the foundational questions about what is doctrine. We spent some time thinking about this so we can identify what were the sort of the core doctrinal concepts for the Soviets that might sort of have plausible sort of relationship to core doctrinal concepts for the Indians. And then we sort of think about, like, the second part is just the mechanisms for diffusion. So there's lots of general sort of mechanisms, general variables that you would think influence how ideas diffuse into military. So there's the systematic geography aspects of the systems effects of on a country, technology, leadership ideas, organizational structures, whether they're professional military or conscript military, civil military balance, their absorptive capacity, all these things. And they all sound pretty internal, as in this is specific to the country itself, but they all have an external element, and that's what we try to draw out. So in the external element, we think that there's a degree of dialogue that can happen between militaries that can then sort of penetrate doctrinal discussions, strategic dialogues, and operational concepts. And so we look at the sort of the direct pathways for Russian and Indian engagement and indirect pathways. So the direct ones are dialogue, commingling, and education. Dialogue I just talked about, these high-level strategic dialogues and sort of military engagements. Commingling would be joint exercises. Education would be staff exchanges and training. I think Feroz referred to sort of the number of Indian officers that were trained in Russian schools. The indirect pathways are sort of this ideational diffusion. So if there are writings that the Russians are producing, the Soviets are producing, and the Indians are reading them in their command and staff college or in their professional military education, that would sort of be an indirect effect. And the other parts of this are the sort of technology and weapons acquisition. If India is acquiring things from the Russians, does that then sort of beget sort of operational concepts or either enable or constrain certain operational concepts? And so we'll walk through this a little bit in terms of the sort of specific cases of, particular types of exercises, ideas, exchanges. And so the direct pathways are actually fairly limited, is kind of our conclusion. The Soviets didn't give a whole lot away to the Indians. They didn't really want to engage in this high level of operational idea sharing. They didn't they did a lot of training, but they were usually on sort of weapon system specific. They didn't do a lot at this command and staff college. But the Indians actually, they specifically didn't allow Indians at the command and staff college. They didn't do joint military exercises in part because the Indians didn't want to have sort of that conspicuous relationship with the Soviets, even though they have this treaty in 1971, the Soviet-Indian sort of treaty of friendship. They don't want to sort of have a proactive tilt towards the Soviets. They're still sort of maintaining it a little more inconspicuous. And so all those direct pathways are kind of absent. And that makes you wonder, well, maybe there's really not much here. But it's the indirect pathways that we find pretty interesting. So the indirect pathways, I think the most consequential one is technology and weapons acquisitions. And so we look through sort of cases of these, the technology and weapons acquisitions, the MiGs and Sukhois, the T-72s, the SSNs, and the Admiral Gorshkov carrier. All these different platforms, we kind of look closely at the details around them. We try to understand what are the motives for the Indians and what are the outcomes that sort of you see alongside that. And in most of these cases, the Indians actually go to the West first. They go to the West because they want access to the highest quality technology. The West either, whether it's Europeans or Americans, aren't really willing to give it to them, particularly in the 70s and 80s, or the price is just not competitive for the Indians. The Indians have sort of a lot of demands even now about offsets and indigenization and sort of the ability to sort of feed into the production cycle or sort of produce domestically. And the Western companies are just not willing to do. The Russians and the Soviets are a little more open to this. So, for example, in the Su-30, the Indians are able to sort of bring in Israeli avionics and sort of adapt it for their own purposes, and then again, sort of they create some domestic production in the process. The one area where we see that seems quite different is the T-72 tank. So, in the 70s, there's a really good article by Chris Clary that sort of we derive a lot of our thinking on Indian doctrine, because there hasn't been a really good piece of literature on Indian doctrine until Chris's article from just last year. And it's the evolution of their doctrine. And really, 1971 is where they really shift doctrine from defense in depth to thinking more proactively about offensive maneuver strategies. And it's strange because in 1971, they had this splendid victory against Pakistan by severing East Pakistan from West Pakistan, creating the state of Bangladesh. And they do it pretty handily. And at the same time, their lessons that are drawn out of this are actually quite negative. They actually realized they were a lot slower, a lot less nimble. And the only reason they were quite successful is because Pakistan really under-resourced East Pakistan to defend West Pakistan. And so it coincides with a leader in the 70s, military leader named Sundarji, is probably sort of one of the leading Indian thinkers, just because a lot of the professional military education in India sort of tends to select out the most sort of thoughtful leaders, and they sort of end at the level of colonel, and then they're left on their own devices. But Sundarji rises in the ranks. He's quite successful, and he always sort of has this idea in the 70s about building this offensive capacity for the Indians, the theory of victory, being able sort of to have a splendid breakthrough against Pakistani forces in fairly rapid, with a high level of speed and firepower, and sort of giving up a little bit of force protection and ability to defend. So he wants to do this in the 70s. The ideas are there as early as 73. It's pretty remarkable, as an aside, that Chris and I were just talking about this, that if you're the Pakistanis in the 1970s and you've just had this defeat handed to you when you've had to sort of basically make a trade for 90,000 prisoners of war, and then you start to observe that the Indians are talking about an even more aggressive strategy because they don't think their initial strategy was aggressive enough, that can really start to sort of spin up an arms race cycle that I don't think is paid much attention to, because we tend to think this sort of really picks up in the 80s, but in the 70s it's quite possible it spun up. So what we find is that the ideas are there and the demands are there on the Indian Army. It's not just Sundarji, there's some other senior officers who are sort of rising in the ranks, and they really want to create a third strike corps, a third mechanized strike corps. So they only have two at this time. Some people today say this third strike corps is actually overkill, and if India is really serious about sort of balancing China, they would disassemble this third strike corps and repurpose it, or repurpose the resources and the costs on personnel that go along with it towards sort of an actually well outfitted mountain corps. But anyways, they build this third strike corps really in the late 70s, early 80s. They start to get the equipment for it, and the backbone of the equipment is the T-72 tank. Because of its combination of firepower and mobility and speed, and sort of and sacrificing, there's a term that I can't remember, but the Centurion tank was sort of the previous sort of baseline for the Indian military. And as they give that up, the sort of the heavier lumbering tank, they are able to sort of think more actively about this operational breakthrough concept, and they're pretty excited about it. And the thing is that they only start to build up this capacity in the 80s as the shadow of nuclear weapons is starting to creep over South Asia. So in a way, they're kind of too late. Once they actually have this sort of in full fruition by the late 80s, they have missed their window, which really puts a premium on the 86, 87 brass tacks crisis, because that's probably in Sundarji's mind the last good chance for them to go and sever Pakistan and to take out their nuclear capacity before it was really fully functional. But it doesn't happen in the late 80s. But nevertheless, they keep the capabilities around, and they keep searching for a way to be able to enact and enable this. And the reason it's consequential for the strategic balance in South Asia is because this is now the fundamental trigger, both prior to 2004 and after 2004, the desire for the Indians to be able to sort of deliver some knockout blows. Prior to 2004, it's still sort of this basic sort of breakthrough concept. After 2004, it's lighter jabs, the cold start doctrine. But in either way, it is what sort of is then sort of prompting Pakistan to lower the threshold for nuclear use, leading to sort of the full spectrum deterrence concepts. And the Indians never really give this up. So this seems like it's not a smoking gun case at all, but it seems like a pretty good case where some things are happening. That the Russians, through their sales, or the Soviets through the sales of the T-72, have enabled a doctrine that India previously was not able to actually enact. So there was a demand side for it, but there was a supply side, and the supply side is what was enabled from that Soviet-Indian relationship. Now, there's another piece of this that we have not really fully explored, and this is the Brahmos Missile aspect, right? So as early as the mid-70s, the Indians are thinking about precision strikes with missile strikes, and that sort of is the genesis for this cooperation with the Russians on the Brahmos Missile. And you look at the Brahmos Missile today, it's hard to tell like what the conventional utility is. I mean, in fact, I was talking to Henry about this at one point. I asked a retired officer from years ago, like, you know, you could use these cruise missiles with great precision. If you ever have a terrorist problem in Afghanistan, just take them out. It's pretty easy. You have to sort of, you know, worry about a little bit of the overflight over Pakistan, but you have the capability to do it. Why do you fear sort of this breakdown in Afghanistan the way the Indians sort of hem and haw? And his response, which I didn't realize was revealing something, was that we wouldn't use a Brahmos missile or a cruise missile on that piddly target. This is a more serious weapon. The cost is not worth it, which then makes you think that there's a strategic effect to this. So combine the Indian demand for delivering blows to Pakistan that are knockout blows to Pakistan with precision capabilities that is increasingly building and in collaboration with the Russians, because the Brahmos is a co-developed platform. The Russians work on the engine, the Indians work on the navigation. They actually do it sort of separately and then made it together. But combine those two together, and you have something that's sort of just been spun out recently in an article in International Security by Chris Clary and Vipin Narang about thinking about preemptive counterforce options that the Indians are thinking about. So there seems to be these residues in a few of the ideas from the Soviet or Russian relationship. It's not clear to me that they're driven by them. It seems that they are, as I said, sort of like a indirect enabling function. But that's interesting in and of itself, because I think at the end of the day, while we're interested in understanding what residues are there of the Soviets and the Russians on the Indians today, we're also trying to think about our own pathways for influencing the Indians. If this is really a strategic relationship with the Indian military and the Indian state as a whole, I think the U.S. military, and I hear this from OSD policy folks all the time, they're constantly trying to think about how do we push the Indians to do more and make them think more expansively about what they can do, particularly in the naval domain, in the Indian Ocean region, being this net security provider. And I think we have tended to focus on these direct mechanisms of like direct engagement, dialogue at the 2+2 level, the military exchanges, et cetera. And we might be better. It might be worth thinking about sort of the indirect ways of sort of the platforms and technology transfers that can actually enable things that the Indians might already want to do, but that can do the things that we are interested in seeing them do in the future as well. So I'll leave it at that. Still fairly early stages of this project, but I'm happy to talk more about it. Thanks.